Starting off our list in our number 10 spot, we have impeccable timing. Okay. This story is one that has quite the plot twist that I absolutely was not expecting. It reads, quote, "There is this one guy in my neighborhood. We seem to operate on the same schedule since we see each other at the bus stop almost every day. We never talk much, he always just asks me for a cigarette and I usually give him one. The problem is that I don't have a sensible schedule. My classes are at a different time every day and get rescheduled more often than not, and I make my own work hours, so I just come in whenever. Last time I saw him was a couple of hours ago. I'm walking home, middle of the night, and some guy jumps me from the back saying, 'Do you have a cigarette?' I turn around and it's the same guy just strolling around the neighborhood at 2:30 a.m. looking for somebody to lend him a smoke. My instincts are telling me that something is seriously wrong here, but what do you guys think? I don't feel like this is just a strange coincidence."
In our number 9 spot today, we have the upstairs neighbor. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This story comes from someone who explains that they live in an apartment building. Their neighbors directly above them are the ones having some extremely fishy behavior. Apparently, it is not abnormal to hear this couple screaming and arguing with each other, which is quite a thing to have to get used to. But here's where things turn sinister. Our storyteller explains that she hasn't seen the wife for at least 3 months now, which obviously isn't normal. And now, suddenly, the husband says that he's going to Malaysia for a while, but our storyteller feels like he's going forever considering he is also selling his apartment. And we still don't know where the wife is. I'm hoping that maybe they just decided to separate since they were obviously arguing all the time and that nothing more sinister is going on here. If I was their neighbor, I'm sure my mind would definitely be racing as well though. In our number 8 spot today, we have this suspicious behavior. This story starts off with a description of the family next door. There are 3 of them, a husband, a wife, and their 2-year-old daughter. Apparently the husband has always been super weird and gave off some bad feelings. He had a really expensive car and apparently basically all he did was drive it and wash it. So, one day the police came knocking on our storyteller's door, and the police explained that apparently the husband and wife next door had supposedly gotten a divorce, but they wanted to know if they happened to know the whereabouts of the wife and daughter because they could not locate them. Our storyteller didn't know anything about their whereabouts, but gave what info she did know, which was that she had a 2-year-old and that she was maybe pregnant and that she drove a white Jeep. After this police visit, they didn't hear anything else, but of course kept their eyes and ears peeled. A few months after the police visit, the creepy husband is outside cleaning his expensive car, and this is when our storyteller sees the wife's white Jeep in the garage of the house. If she had run off, why would she leave her car? The creepy husband saw our storyteller see the Jeep, and just a few short days later, he ended up selling it. This could all just be a coincidence, but it certainly is all a little suspicious. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Skull Stealer. This next story is one that our storyteller luckily didn't have to witness, but it definitely is still quite strange. Apparently this neighbor man was out and about searching for gold one day, and on his way back he ended up being pulled over for some reason. The police ended up searching this man's car when they found something I don't think anyone was expecting. They found a real human skull. Sinister or not, why would you ever have something like that in the back of your car? This guy's excuse is that he found it while he was out searching and thought it belonged to an Indigenous American. This man was most definitely arrested, and unfortunately our storyteller doesn't know how the rest of this story panned out, but if it wasn't already clear, if you ever find a human skull, please don't take it home with you. In our number 6 spot today, we have Always Watching. This story is about the family that lived across the street from our storyteller when they were in high school. Our storyteller would walk to and from school every day, and while the mornings were normal, when he was coming home every day is when things got very weird. This family across the street would sit and stare out the window at this guy every single day as he returned from school. I couldn't imagine this happening to me once, let alone every single day, but that truly sounds like an absolute nightmare. To make things just a little more strange, it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to get phone calls from their scary neighbors' phone numbers, but when they answered, there just wasn't anyone on the other end. I feel like I would have immediately put my house up for sale or something, because every night I would feel like I would need to sleep with one eye open. In our number 5 spot today, we have Stay Away. This story comes from someone who had some weird neighbors when they were around 9 or 10 years old. The people who actually lived next door were a middle-aged couple, and while they didn't have any kids of their own, they had 3 nieces who were around the same age as him, so they would play together often. One day the couple invited our storyteller to church with them. There isn't necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but what happens next is where things turned a little strange. This couple then proceeded to explain why this child should come to church with them, which already sounds creepy. They began to explain that the world was about to end and that they were preparing for that. These fully grown adults literally told the child that if he wanted to live, he should go to church with them. I have a strong feeling that if he wanted to live, the best thing to do would be to absolutely not go to church with them under any circumstances. Who knows what church they were going to, but there's no way it was good. In our number 4 spot today, we have This Dangerous Fence. This story comes from someone from a family with 4 siblings for a total of 5 kids. They were all pretty rambunctious and unfortunately had the pleasure of living next to a family with 2 children, both of which were, of course, very well behaved. Obviously, the neighbor dad didn't take too kindly to living next door to a bunch of wild children, considering he had 2 perfect little angels. But he certainly took things way too far. One day our storyteller was climbing around on the fence that separated the 2 properties, and this set off the neighbor dad. Instead of doing literally anything normal, he decided to do one of the most messed up things he could. He took those nails that are used for carpets to grip the flooring and stuck them in bars of wood, which he then placed on top of the fence. Keep in mind that our storyteller is around 5 years old at this time. So every time he would try to climb to the top, he would be stuck by a nail, which would then cause him to fall off. Luckily, our storyteller never got seriously injured or anything from this, but how weird is it for the neighbor dad to react like that? In our number 3 spot today, we have The Rose Garden. This story comes from someone's aunt and is about a neighbor she had in the 70s and 80s. This neighbor was harmless but had quite a creepy pastime. This neighbor volunteered at a blood bank, which is obviously great, but since the 70s and 80s were pretty much just a free-for-all, there was an insane blood bank rule that allowed this neighbor lady to be able to take home the bags of blood that were expired and would be thrown out. I truly cannot believe that was a thing, but I guess this lady was resourceful. She would take these bags of blood and then use them as fertilizer for her garden. Our storyteller's aunt explains that you would see her out there on her knees, digging around with a big floppy sun hat, just working human blood into the soil around her roses. They end off this story by explaining that all of the flowers in her garden were truly magnificent, and I guess maybe she really was onto something. In our number 2 spot today, we have The Next Door Dentist. This story comes from someone whose neighbor was a dentist, and he lived with his wife, and they apparently had one creepy child. Our storyteller explains that this weird family next door once absolutely freaked out on them for planting some flowers alongside their fence. They didn't go into detail about why, but the dentist family screamed as they said they didn't want anyone digging up their land. That's a reasonable request for sure, but also very, very suspicious. The dentist family ended up moving out 2 years after this strange incident, and our storyteller didn't really think much of them until 3 years after that. In an absolutely wild but not surprising turn of events, the dentist's dad ended up being arrested for kidnapping his patients. Our storyteller still has never had confirmation, but truly believes that there are still bodies located down there. In our number 1 spot today, we have Peeping Tom. Okay, so this one is truly one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. This story comes from a man who lives with his wife, and they have a downstairs neighbor who is certainly something else. First, this creepy neighbor approaches the wife and says to her that he can hear her and her husband all the time, with a super creepy and sinister grin on his face, which is absolutely horrifying to even think of. This is already creepy, but this story unfortunately gets worse. One day the wife was painting the porch of the house and accidentally dropped a paintbrush. She bent down to pick it up and sadly had to see what no one should have to see. Through the slits in the deck, she saw this creepy neighbor's eyes staring up at her. Tell me why this creepy man was laying under the porch, staring up at her, being a weirdo peeping Tom. They have no idea how long he was there for, and honestly, they probably don't even want to know.
Starting off at our number 10 spot, we have the entrepreneur. Okay, this neighbor story starts out actually quite nice before it takes one of the wildest turns I've ever seen. So basically, the storyteller starts out by explaining that their old neighbor was like the perfect neighbor. They were quiet, they were polite and cordial, and sometimes the two of them would even share a quick chat should they run into each other in the hall. Truly the dream neighbor. The story starts to take a different turn when the storyteller reveals that their nice neighbor is certainly in the business of selling illicit substances, we'll call them. But they also explain that all of his customers were also lovely and were sure to not make too much noise when they were coming by, even if it was late at night or early in the morning. Now, here's where the story takes quite the turn. Turns out that one night, some sort of altercation ensued, and this nice, quiet neighbor ended up taking the lives of two people who were at his door. Apparently, it all happened in the hallway, which was quite a gruesome scene afterwards. The storyteller has quite the twist again at the end when they write, quote, "It was crazy. Still, after he got sent to prison, a new guy moved in that played music constantly as loud as he possibly could. I'll take old Stevie back any day." Honestly, I don't agree, but I completely understand. In our number 9 spot today, we have The Agent. This neighbor story comes from someone who lived in an apartment building and who had one neighbor who was exceptionally nosy and suspicious of others in the building. So much so that she decided to do something absolutely insane, which was to stage phone calls with FBI headquarters about other tenants in the building and what she called alarming behavior. This behavior she's referencing would have to be something super outlandish and crazy for her to go to those lengths, right? Oh no, we're talking like people coming home after 9 p.m. and she's like, better call the FBI. The story then continues on to say that she even went as far as to post a fake government notice on the walls of the building. This lady just will not quit. So, guess what made this lady stop all of her nonsense? Well, the storyteller decided to take a page out of her book and they staged a fake phone call. This time, they just loudly chatted about the illegalities of everything that this lady was doing, including her impersonation of an FBI agent. Who would have guessed? Shortly after this staged call, the neighbor lady stopped. In our number 8 spot today, we have Peeping Tom. Okay, so this one is truly one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. This story comes from a man who lives with his wife, and they have a downstairs neighbor who is certainly something else. First, this neighbor approaches the wife and says to her that he can hear her and her husband all the time, with a super creepy and sinister grin on his face, which is already absolutely horrifying to even think of. This is already enough to just give you the heebie-jeebies, but this story unfortunately gets worse. One day the wife was painting the porch of the house and accidentally dropped a paintbrush. She bent down to pick it up, and this is when she had to see what no one should have to see. Through the slits in the deck, she saw this creepy neighbor's eyes staring up at her. Tell me why this guy was just laying under the porch staring up at her being a weirdo peeping Tom while she painted the porch. They have no idea how long he was there for, and honestly, they probably don't even want to know. In our number 7 spot today, we have the next door dentist. This story comes from someone whose neighbor was a dentist and he lived with his wife, and they apparently had one kinda creepy child. Our storyteller explains that this weird family next door once absolutely freaked out at them for planting some flowers alongside their fence. They didn't go into detail about why, but the dentist's family screamed as they said they didn't want anyone digging up their land. That's a reasonable request for sure, but also a little suspicious. The dentist's family ended up moving out 2 years after this strange incident, and our storyteller didn't really think of them much until 3 years after that. In an absolutely wild but not surprising turn of events, the dentist dad ended up being arrested for kidnapping his patients. Our storyteller still has never had confirmation, but truly believes that there are still bodies located there on the property. In our number 6 spot today, we have Always Watching. This story is about the family that lived across the street from our storyteller when they were in high school. Our storyteller would walk to and from school every day, and while the mornings were normal, when he was coming home every day is when things got weird. This family across the street would sit and stare out the window at this guy every single day as he returned from school. I couldn't imagine this happening to me once, let alone every day. That truly sounds like an absolute nightmare. To make things just a little more strange, it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to get phone calls from their scary neighbor's phone number, but when they answered, there just wasn't anyone on the other line. I feel like I would have immediately put my house up for sale or something, because every night I would feel like I need to sleep with one eye open. In our number 5 spot today, we have The Cat Came Back. Okay, last time, on part 1, we had a weird neighbor cat story, and this time we have another one that is arguably weirder and creepier. I'm just saying, if you've got a cat and a strange neighbor, you might want to watch out because these stories are putting me on edge. This one goes, quote, there was an old man who lived next door to my last house. I'd wake up every morning to about an hour of, here kitty kitty kitty. My cat once went missing for about a week and he came back with a shaved stomach. Listen, without the whole neighbor part, that story would still be weird and concerning. I'm glad the cat came back, but why in the world was his stomach shaved? Maybe it wasn't the neighbor, I mean there's no proof per se, but man, the whole thing is definitely weird. If it wasn't the neighbor, then what on earth was he up to calling for a cat every morning? I have a lot of questions about this one, and I don't think that any of them are getting answered anytime soon. In our number 4 spot today, we have the photographer. This strange neighbor story is a very short but exceptionally effective one. The storyteller wrote just, quote, they sent me pictures of myself mowing the lawn. I had no idea. Imagine getting a photo of yourself that you had no idea someone else took, let alone your neighbor. I feel like I would always feel as if someone's eyes were on me after that. Just full of paranoia to the brim. In our number 3 spot today, we have the eavesdropper. This neighbor story is about someone who loves to eavesdrop and get involved in things that certainly aren't their business, and they managed to take it way too far. This person wrote, quote, we had this neighbor that was always in our business. He would tap our phone lines and listen to our problems and then call my grandfather to tell him what was going on with my parents' marriage. We would also find footprints and fresh snowfall walking all around our property and onto our deck. Weird dude. Honestly, I feel like I would be making up some crazy outlandish stories just to test to see if this man really was listening in. I would say that I had like treasure buried in the backyard or something and see if he tried to dig it up. This story certainly is strange, but the storyteller seems fairly casual about the whole experience, so it seems as though it's a story that stuck with them but didn't bother them too much. In our number 2 spot today, we have the vet visit. Okay, I don't know what it is with people and pets, but neighbors seriously need to leave other people's alone. This story starts out with a storyteller taking their dog for a pretty regular or standard visit to the vet. While on this visit, however, things start to take a turn when the vet tells them to stop feeding the dog human food. This confused them because they were quite strict about only feeding their dog food. Well, after a little investigation, it turns out that the neighbor this storyteller had, this one who would often call the police about this dog's behavior even though it was a nice, sweet Labrador that showed no aggression at all, yeah, apparently this neighbor had been leaning over the fence to feed the dog food scraps, mop water, and some other harmful things. This one might actually be worse than the neighbors who were stealing the cats. This is truly next level, and I'm glad that the vet was able to catch this and the storyteller could get to the bottom of it all. In our number 1 spot today, we have the neighbor across the hall. Okay guys, this one is definitely the most serious on this list, and it truly is terrifying. Basically, this storyteller's dad lives in an apartment building, and one day he gets a knock on the door and it turns out to be the police. They come in and start asking this man about his neighbor across the hall. They ask him if he's seen anything weird or that sort of thing, but the dad tells them no. He looks well put together, like a businessman, he's around 30, just nothing out of the ordinary, you know, just a regular guy who just lives across the hall. The police then explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and that she was last seen on security camera footage walking into the building with that guy, but the security camera never captured either of them leaving. In the end, the police get a warrant and they notice a missing shower curtain and that there's golf clubs everywhere, and at this point they place the neighbor under arrest. Sadly, about 3 weeks later, the police found the missing woman, but someone had taken her life. They then go on to write, quote, then about 2 months ago they found more tapes. As the investigators went back to look at them, they discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But like I said earlier, all of the clubs were in his room. It definitely doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what is going on here at all. I guess this neighbor guy is now saying that it was an accident and he panicked and tried to hide it because he had a girlfriend. At the time the person posted this story, the guy's trial was coming up, and I'm sure it didn't exactly go well for him.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Let's Celebrate. Okay, so this story is one wild ride, and it is honestly actually pretty terrifying. One night, a young woman was coming home late after she had been out having a few alcoholic beverages. Her creepy neighbor unfortunately witnessed this and for some reason decided to head to her front door with her. Her birthday had recently passed, and so when her weird neighbor tried to give her a hug, she just assumed it was him trying to be nice, but things quickly got even more strange. As she was trying to get into her own home, he kept insisting he should come in and have a drink with her so that they could celebrate more appropriately. Absolutely not. This woman was thinking quick because she decided to tell him that she couldn't find her keys, and then she quickly pulled out her phone and she said she was calling someone who might have them. She was actually calling her cousin though, and she told him how scared she was. He lived close by, so he jumped out of bed and drove really quickly to come and pick her up. I wish this was the end of the story, but she explains that shortly after this creepy night, her neighbor actually ended up poisoning one of her dogs just out of pure pettiness. That is so insane.
In our number 9 spot today, we have the plot twist. As if that one wasn't enough. Okay, this story is a short one, but man is it effective. They start out by saying, quote, "I used to live in a house that was split into 2 apartments. My neighbor had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers, stank up everything we owned." Okay, that definitely sucks. I'm sure it's a situation many people have dealt with before, and it would be really frustrating, and honestly, it's hazardous. Surprisingly though, this isn't the worst of it. There's one more sentence to the story, and it somehow still manages to take us on quite a journey. So after they wrote, quote, "stake up everything we owned," they finished with, quote, "then one of them stole my car." Okay, honestly, worse than the smoke, and also I have a million questions about this, starting with how and ending with what happened after. I would love a follow-up on this one. In our number 8 spot today, we have a house's history. So there are places that have certain rules around what a selling agent would have to tell an interested buyer about the history of the house prior to purchasing. Some things are extremely important to some people and not at all to others. I mean, for example, some people don't really mind living in houses that were once the scene of a horrific crime. I personally feel like I wouldn't exactly be comfortable with that. Some things in some areas, however, don't have such widespread rules when it comes to these things, which means that sometimes new homeowners are in for quite a surprise, just like these ones. This story starts off, quote, "When we moved in, he," meaning the neighbor, "came over to tell us the house had previously burned down twice. News to us." Okay, that's interesting, but not too scary yet, but they continue on to say, quote, "Got the feeling he wanted to sort of brag about how he saved people from the fires. Then a few years later, after leaving our garage door open, we found our stored grill with all the unlit burners on and a bit of burnt paper sitting underneath. He's since disappeared, but we lock up our propane now." What in the world? How terrifying! The man disappeared? This is why I Google everything first. From places to people, I scour the internet prior because you never know, people are strange. In our number 7 spot today, we have the backdoor neighbor. This story starts off when a couple moved into a new house in the summer of 2019. Upon moving in, both of the neighbors on either side warned this couple about the neighbor who lived behind them, as they had been known to cause quite a bit of trouble. The first 6 months were fine, but things quickly took a turn. They go on to explain that, quote, "Their house sits on a hill behind ours, and so it overlooks the majority of our backyard due to the elevation change. Well, one night, morning technically, at about 3 AM we wake up to ring notifications from our phones showing video from our front doorbell. There's a man standing barefoot in a sleeveless shirt on our porch pounding on our front door. We give it 2 to 3 minutes just watching him on the app, thinking maybe he's drunk and has the wrong house, essentially giving him the benefit of the doubt. At this point, the guy at the door starts to yell, he's cursing, he's saying that he's gonna fight them, and then he leaves the front to head around the side of the house towards the backyard. They still have no idea who this is, so they of course call the police. Before the police arrive, the neighbor behind them turns on a huge spotlight that's shining into the storyteller's backyard, and they're thinking, okay, our neighbors, they know something's going on and they gave us some light to like check it all out or whatever. Turns out, not the case at all. Once the police arrive, it becomes clear that the spotlight neighbor is the one who was pounding on the door, and here's the reason. The neighbor said to the police when they showed up that he was angry because a few nights prior, in the middle of the night, the storyteller let his dog out in his own backyard, but that when he did it, he was in his boxers, and the neighbor was claiming that he did it on purpose to make him uncomfortable since their yard looks down on the storytellers and they could see everything. They then write, quote, "He then followed this up to the police with evidence, which consisted of videos he had taken through our windows of my wife and I inside our own home doing totally normal things like chores, watching TV, etc. Nothing inappropriate or scandalous, not that it would have mattered anyway, we were in our own home." This story truly is next level. In the end, the police clearly understood that there was a breach of privacy, and it is said that the weird neighbors moved out a few months after and the couple celebrated that like it was a holiday. And I do not blame them one little bit. In our number 6 spot today we have Sebald. Okay, so what happened to friendly neighbors coming over to ask to borrow a cup of sugar? Was that ever how things were, or is that just what movies in Hollywood fed us? It's gotta be made up, right? Or else how did we get from that to this? This story reads, quote, "A guy named Sebald. He straight up smelled like tuna all the time. He'd come knock on our door to ask for random things in his robe. A rubber band, an apple slicer, a doorstop, like probably once a week. My bedroom door faced his kitchen, and sometimes I'd look over and see him lying on the floor. It was bizarre. Sebald, what in the world is going on? Are you okay? Listen, this isn't the scariest or the worst neighbor. The man just needs some items and likes lying on the floor. I'm certainly not judging, I'm just wondering why. I would have a lot of questions for Sebald if he was my neighbor, but hey, at least he's not out here causing harm. That's definitely more than we can say for some other people on today's list." In our number 5 spot today we have the early riser. Okay, if anyone has any idea as to what could be going on in this one, please let me know, because from where I'm standing, it just is all extremely weird. This weird neighbor story explains that this specific neighbor loved to get up early. Not like absurdly early, but a solid 6 a.m. wake up every day, which is for sure a commitment. That isn't weird, a lot of people do that, but what a lot of people don't do after their 6 a.m. wake up every day is proceed to go out into the backyard of their home and fight a random mannequin while shouting at the top of their lungs. I guess the whole neighborhood is waking up at 6 a.m. every morning now, too, because this guy's got some steam he needs to release. Honestly, this would be the most annoying thing, but I'd also be very curious and concerned as to what this was all about. In our number 4 spot today we have Goat Guy. Okay, this is definitely not an inherently terrifying story, but it is so bizarre that it has me just a little on edge. So basically, this short little explanation is, quote, "Old guy that lived next door when I was young would shower in the backyard, would buy goats to do his lawn. Eventually he stopped buying goats and would just set the lawn on fire. I mean, buying goats to eat your grass so you don't have to cut it is a very expensive method, but a method nonetheless. But setting it on fire? What an absolute hazard to yourself and everyone around you. There's just so much bizarrety going on in this one, I don't even know what to think." In our number 3 spot today we have Linda Listen. This neighbor story starts off with a storyteller explaining that they have quite a few interesting neighbor stories from this one in particular named Linda. They go on to write, quote, "Linda would often have men outside the apartment building that she locked out screaming her name. But the best story regards a boyfriend Linda had who insisted my roommate and I call him the Captain. About a week after meeting him, we came home to a wedding announcement for Linda and the Captain. Yes, his name was the Captain on the announcement. Exactly 1 week later still, the Captain was arrested outside of our apartment building for public intoxication at 2 a.m. while screaming, 'I've made a huge mistake. F you, Linda, a huge mistake. I'm ruined.' It seems as though this guy was no longer the Captain. I have no idea what happened here or what led to this demise, but I mean, I can't exactly say I'm surprised." In our number 2 spot today we have Cat Lady. This story is from someone named Kate, and she starts off explaining that she had a cat named Donovan and her strange neighbor was named Susan. Susan was single, in her 50s, seemed nice, and had a lovely garden. Kate then goes on to write, quote, "One summer we were going on vacation for a week. We asked if she could look after the cat while we were gone. She enthusiastically said yes and offered to have our cat stay at her house so it wouldn't get bored or lonely. How sweet of her." Kate then explains that they go away on vacation, everything's great, but when they came back and Kate's mom went to pick up the cat, things went awry. She explains that Susan was weirdly attached to this cat after 1 week, so much so that she was full on weeping when she was giving the cat back. Kate's mom was weirded out but thanked her, paid her, and then left. Kate then goes on to write that a few days later she woke up early and came to find out that Susan had walked the entire acre that separated their houses in order to try and look for Donovan. She was saying that she just needed to see her baby. Kate says that it was weird, but they let it go this time. But then she writes, quote, "Then one day we had let our cat out for a while, it was an indoor-outdoor cat, and when we called him to come in, he didn't come. We checked all the places he usually lounged and he was nowhere to be found. We searched for hours. Finally, after a day of searching, my dad said, 'Oh my god, Susan,' could she? My parents quickly went over there to ask if she had seen the cat, and Susan vehemently denied knowing anything about where the cat was. She was visibly angry about being asked, and then offered up, "What do you think, that I stole him?" Then my mom started calling his name and whistling for him, and before Susan could get the door slammed, he strolled to the door from somewhere inside the house and greeted my mom with a meow. My mom was pissed. She started yelling about, "If you ever steal our cat again, and I ought to call the police," and left. He was an indoor cat for the next few months until we moved again. Honestly, could you imagine your neighbor stealing your animal? I would have absolutely lost my mind. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Flyers. So this story starts out with a storyteller explaining to us that he lives in a fourplex that is mostly elderly people living in it, and that there was another fourplex across from them, and that was basically the situation for the entire block. So one night, when our storyteller is going out with some friends, as they're leaving his place, a neighbor of his comes out, and a very hateful altercation ensues. The neighbor man yells some horrible things, the storyteller yells some things back, and that's when the neighbor makes some very serious threats, and then the storyteller just carries on with heading out for the night. Then he goes on to write, quote, "Well, when I got home, he had super glued my screen door completely shut, poured hamburger helper or something similar into my AC unit, scratched up my very expensive and still quite new Lexus SUV." This isn't where it ends though. They then take photos from the storyteller's Facebook and use them to spread a horrible, dangerous rumor about the storyteller. The insane neighbor used these photos to make posters and flyers spreading this rumor, and then on the back of them, quote, "He stated where I worked, what time I left, what time I arrived, when I took lunch, and where I went on the weekends. It was very unusual. I ended up having to take him to court, file a restraining order against him after he showed up to my job, threatened to burn down my building, which I finally had enough and went outside to fight him. Luckily, my employees already had him cornered out in the parking lot. Thank God for restraining orders."